So last week I mentioned rather briefly about the Summit Tunnel, and like many things railway, I was curious and I wanted to dig a little deeper, quite literally. It was the mid-1830s, the spark of the railway boom was flickering and investors were keen to get on board. The proposals for a line between Manchester and Leeds was on the cards as early as 1825. But unlike the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, which was proposed around the same time, the line between Leeds and Manchester failed to get much traction and ultimately it was abandoned. Following the success of Rocket and the Manchester and Liverpool Railway, plans were drawn yet again to connect the two towns. Even with the world's most influential engineers, the plans were once again shelved. It was third time lucky for the railway when it was finally given the green light and was given capital to produce its railway. In 1835 the company was formed and given capital of about £800,000 to help establish the company. The railway was to link up at Normanton and the North Midland Railway. It was decreed that the new railway would be given running powers over part of the North Midland territory, and 9 miles of North Midland proposed tracks was earmarked. The Golden 9 miles, which would be built by the North Midland, would allow for the Leeds and Manchester Railway to become a reality, and to stop any unfair business tactics, it was decreed that if North Midland failed in its tasks, then the Leeds and Manchester Railway would be willing and waiting to step in. The 51-mile track was daunting. Along with several bridges, the largest obstacle would be the Pennines near Littleborough. As it was the highest point on the new line, going over the massive hill wasn't really an option, so the only way to cross the Pennines was to go through it. The task of designing the tunnel fell to Thomas Gooch. Gooch was heavily involved in several railway schemes and heavily collaborated with George Stevenson, and eventually became the Leeds and Manchester Railway's chief engineer, stepping in for George Stevenson when he was working in on other projects. Gooch in turn turned to fellow engineer Barnard Dickinson, with Dickinson proclaiming that the tunnel will defy the rage of tempest, fire, war, or wasting age. In 1838 the first brick was laid by the chairman of the Leeds and Manchester Railway, and 23 million of them will follow. The tunnel was dug by hand, with scores of bricklayers following to shore up the tunnel walls with 6 layers of brickwork. The bricks were made in the local area and over 60,000 of them were laid daily. The bricks were sealed with mortar, which has water-repelling properties. To ensure the tunnel was properly aligned, 14 vertical shafts were dug from the surface and were used for surveying, ventilation, and for getting the spoil out of the tunnel by use of stationary steam engines or horses. It was very likely that the crews used for this monumental task were navvies, and over 1,200 were reported to be working on the tunnel at any one time. The work though was slow and very dangerous. The bedrock and blue shale was difficult to remove and cave-ins were common. Men and boys would dig by candlelight, using basic tools with little regard to safety. In the end, 41 people building the tunnel died in various accidents around the site. George Stevenson, though, was not impressed with the progress and the lack of organisation. In March 1839, he took over the project and dismissed the contractors and set in his own. Work progressed much quicker. The tunnel was completed by New Year's Eve 1840, but a fault had caused the central track drain to be displaced and had to be fixed. Finally, after many delays, setbacks and even a bricklayer strike, the tunnel was opened, delayed and over budget in March of 1841. True to Barnard Dickinson's words, the mile-long tunnel survived without incident for over 100 years. It was undamaged through 2 world wars, and other than the odd bit of maintenance, it stood strong. December 1984 was horrific for British Rail. It had several serious incidents on its network within days of each other, resulting in scores of people injured and 3 people killed, and was facing their customers' wrath. It was hoped that with Christmas approaching, they would see the back of this dismal time and move on. On the 20th of December, a freight train from Teesside to Warrington set off on a standard run. The train was carrying over 1 million litres of high-grade petrol across its 13 tankers. The tankers were specially designed for carrying fuel and had done so for many years. Around 6 a.m, the train entered the tunnel at about 40 miles an hour, and again nothing was unusual. But about a third of the way through, the fourth tanker on the train derailed, causing a chain reaction with the other tankers. The three-man crew's shock turned to horror when they saw the telltale flicker of orange coming from the ballast and under the tracks. Fully aware of their potential dangerous load, the men fled the tunnel and called for help. Fire crews from both Greater Manchester Fire Brigade and West Yorkshire responded promptly to the fire and began to tackle it from both sides. Meanwhile, the train crew was persuaded to go back inside the tunnel to uncouple the derailed tankers from the unaffected ones and drive the 3 remaining tankers and the engine to safety. As the train was cleared, the Manchester Fire Brigade loaded fire equipment onto track trolleys and headed into the tunnel. At the same time, the Yorkshire Fire Brigade did the same, as well as lower several hoses down via the vents on the top of the tunnel. Time and temperature were against the crews, however. In order to prevent explosions and tank rupture, if the tankers were overpressured, they would release the pressure in relief valves. The fire was causing the tankers to become seriously overpressured, and just before 10, one of the tanker's relief valves opened, releasing petrol vapour. The vapour instantly caught fire and directed the gas right onto the brick wall like a flamethrower. The walls, not designed to cope with the heat, began to strain and the bricks began to melt. Seeing the danger, the fire crews evacuated, and it was just in time. The first of the tankers, unable to cope, exploded, sending fuel and fire everywhere. Fortunately for everyone, and in a rather unusual quirk, the flames and the fire were vented upwards and out through shafts 8 and 9 rather than across the length of the tunnel. The explosion caused temperature in the tunnel to rise rapidly, and in turn more and more of the tanker's relief vents began to open. 2 tankers simply melted as the 1500-degree heat consumed everything it could. The vents, which saved the crews from the explosion, now became a rather large problem. The air within the tunnel was so rich with fuel that oxygen was becoming scarce. If the tunnel had no vents, the fire would have extinguished itself. However, the gases were drawn upwards and out of vents 8 and 9. As soon as the hot gases touched the cold, crisp air, it instantly ignited, sending 45-metre pillars of fire into the atmosphere that could be seen for miles. The fire sucked clean air into the tunnel, where it became enriched, and 8 and 9 vented the gases out. It was a perfect and vicious cycle. The gases were moving at such a speed that large objects such as melted metal, ballast and tanker parts were ejected from the vents. Many likened the site as volcanoes and caused much of the surrounding countryside to catch fire. The fire brigade, knowing that fighting the fire from the mouth of the tunnel was fruitless, decided to concentrate efforts on the ventilation shafts. Unable to get close to the towering inferno of 8 and 9, they started at the far end of the tunnel and used expanding foam to cover the ventilation shafts, working their way in. Their plan worked and the cycle was broken, but the fire still continued to burn. It took 33 hours to get the blaze under some form of control, but spontaneous fires would break out as the gases would hit the hot tunnel lining. The 2 brigades would stay on site on and off right through Christmas and into the new year, damping down and shoring up the tunnel. The investigation into the cause of the fire started in earnest, and despite the damage, it was very simple to see what had happened. A small axle bearing on tanker 4 had failed, causing the axle to derail, and in the crash, one of the tankers had fallen on its side and ruptured. The gas from the petrol bled into the damaged axle box, and the damage and the heat was enough to ignite the fumes. This and other accidents earlier in the month brought British Rail into disrepute, and an inquiry was launched into the whole network into its safety practices. In the tunnel, it was established that over 80% of the petrol was consumed by the fire, but incredibly, damage to the tunnel was surprisingly small. Only half a mile of trackbed was affected, and the walls had stood up amazingly well. Instead of cracking, the bricks that were close to the fire simply melted and looked to some like a strange type of glass. It only took 8 months for the damage to be repaired. Shafts 8 and 9 were shored up and permanently sealed with foam. As a thank you to the thousands of passengers and locals that were affected by the non-running of the trains, British Rail allowed a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for the locals to walk the full length of the tunnel before passenger service resumed in August. Once again, the tunnel is fully operational, and it is to this day. The tunnel has only ever been closed off twice since due to a train hitting ice dropped from an event, and in October 2021, when upgrade work meant the replacement of the tracks. But if you want to know more, especially about the fire, then head over to the Mason's Arm pub in Todmorden. They have the best collection of photos taken at the time of the fire, along with a famous quote from the Leeds and Manchester Railway's own engineer, George Stevenson, who states that he would stake my reputation and my head that the tunnel will never fail so as to injure any human life. Considering his reputation and his head is still where it should be, I think we will have safe passage through the tunnel for many years to come.